Why Japan's lost decades are coming to America, the zombie economy. Imagine you're 25 years old. You just graduated from a good university. You did everything right. You got the degree, you wore the suit, you shook the hands, and now you're staring at your first real job offer. The salary? It's exactly the same, adjusted for inflation, as what your father made in 1995. Same position, same company, same money. 30 years of your life, and the economic needle hasn't moved an inch. Welcome to Japan. Or, as I should say, welcome to America in about 5 years. Right now, the United States is walking the exact same path that Japan stumbled down in 1990. We're making the same policy mistakes. We're believing the same lies about stimulus and money printing. We're propping up the same zombie companies that should have died years ago. And we're about to learn the same brutal lesson that the Japanese learned over 3 lost decades. You cannot print your way to prosperity. You cannot bail out your way to growth. You cannot avoid pain by simply delaying it. All you can do is make the pain longer, duller, and more soul-crushing. Today, we're going to dissect the Japanese disease. We're going to show you exactly how a wealthy, high-tech superpower turned itself into an economic museum, where nothing grows, nothing dies, and an entire generation gave up on the future. And then we're going to show you why America is about to hit copy-paste on the exact same playbook. This isn't theory. This is pattern recognition. And the pattern is terrifying. Let's begin. 1. The bubble that never really popped. How Japan created a fake recovery. To understand where America is headed, we have to go back to Tokyo in 1989. This was peak Japan. This was the moment when Japanese businessmen were buying Rockefeller Center and Pebble Beach Golf Course. This was when Sony bought Columbia Pictures and people genuinely believed that Japan was going to economically conquer the United States without firing a single shot. The Nikkei stock index hit 38,915 on December 29, 1989. Real estate in Tokyo was so expensive that the land under the Imperial Palace was theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. But it was all a lie. It was the mother of all asset bubbles, fueled by cheap credit from the Bank of Japan and a banking system that had lost its mind. Japanese banks were lending money to anyone who wanted to speculate on real estate. You could borrow at 2% interest and buy a building that was appreciating at 20% a year. It was free money, until it wasn't. In 1990, the bubble popped, stock prices collapsed, real estate values plummeted. And suddenly, the banks that had lent trillions of yen against inflated collateral realized they were sitting on mountains of bad debt. In a normal, healthy economy, here's what should have happened. The bad banks should have failed. The zombie companies that couldn't pay their loans should have gone bankrupt. The bad debt should have been liquidated. Yes, it would have been painful. Yes, unemployment would have spiked. But after 2 or 3 brutal years, the economy would have cleared the wreckage and started growing again. That's what happened in the United States after the early 1980s recession. Paul Volcker raised interest rates to crushing levels, killed inflation, caused a recession, and then the economy came roaring back. But Japan didn't do that. Japan panicked. The Japanese government looked at the carnage and said, "We cannot let these banks fail. We cannot let these companies go bankrupt. We must protect jobs." So they did something that sounded compassionate but was actually catastrophic. They bailed everyone out. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates to 0. The government pumped trillions of yen into the banking system. They changed accounting rules so that banks didn't have to admit how bad their losses were. They created a system where banks could keep bad loans on their books, pretend they were still good, and keep lending money to companies that were effectively dead. These became known as zombie companies. They were businesses that didn't make enough profit to pay off their debts, but the banks kept them on life support by rolling over the loans and pretending everything was fine. Why would banks do this? Because if they admitted the company was bankrupt, they'd have to write off the loan and take a loss, and if they took too many losses, the bank itself would become insolvent. So they played a game of extend and pretend, extend the loan, pretend it's fine, and hope that someday, somehow, the economy would recover and bail them out. It never did. By the late 1990s, estimates suggested that somewhere between 10% and 30% of all Japanese companies were zombies. They weren't growing. They weren't innovating. They were just existing, consuming capital and resources that should have gone to new dynamic businesses. And here's the economic poison of zombie companies. When you keep the dead businesses alive, you starve the living ones. Think about it. If you're a healthy, innovative startup trying to compete with a zombie corporation, you're at a massive disadvantage. The zombie company can undercut you on price because they don't actually need to make a profit. The bank will keep lending them money regardless. They can hoard workers, keeping wages low across the industry. They suck up credit that should be going to productive ventures. This is why Japan's productivity growth died. This is why Japanese wages have been flat for 30 years. The entire economy became a museum where nothing was allowed to fail. which meant nothing was allowed to succeed. The government kept promising that recovery was just around the corner. They spent trillions on infrastructure projects, building bridges to nowhere and highways that no one used. They called it stimulus, but you can't stimulate an economy by digging holes and filling them back up. All they did was rack up debt while the underlying sickness festered. 2. The zero interest rate trap, when free money destroys wealth. Let's talk about the weapon that Japan used to fight the crash and the weapon that ultimately destroyed them: interest rates. When the bubble popped in 1990, the Bank of Japan did what every central bank does in a crisis. They slashed interest rates. They went from 6% down to 2%, then 1%, then 0.5%, and by 1999 they hit 0% interest rates, free money. The theory was simple. If we make borrowing cheap enough, businesses will borrow and invest. Consumers will borrow and spend. The economy will start growing again. But here's what actually happened. Nothing. Businesses didn't borrow because they were already drowning in debt and there was no demand for their products. Consumers didn't borrow because they were terrified of losing their jobs and they were watching their life savings evaporate in the stock market. So the money just sat there. The Bank of Japan had pushed interest rates to 0 and the economy still wouldn't move. They had run out of ammunition. This is what economists call the zero lower bound, or the liquidity trap. When interest rates hit 0, you can't cut them anymore. Well, technically you can. You can go negative, which Japan eventually did, but we'll get to that horror show in a minute. At 0%, the central bank loses its most powerful tool. It's like a doctor whose only medicine is aspirin, and the patient has a severed artery. More aspirin isn't going to help. But here's the truly insidious part of zero interest rate policy that nobody talks about. It destroys savers. Think about what interest rates actually are. They are the price of time. They are the reward you get for delaying gratification, for not spending your money today, and instead lending it to someone else to use productively. When you put money in a savings account, you're lending that money to the bank. They pay you interest as a thank you. But when interest rates are 0, there is no thank you. Your savings don't grow. In fact, after you account for inflation, even low inflation, your savings are shrinking. You're being punished for being responsible. In Japan, an entire generation of people who did everything right, who saved diligently, who didn't take on debt, watched their nest eggs slowly die. A retiree who had $1 million in savings in 1990, if they kept it in a bank account, would have earned basically nothing for 30 years. Meanwhile, the cost of living, even in a low inflation environment, slowly ate away at the purchasing power of that money. This creates a vicious cycle. Savers, realizing that saving is pointless, either stop saving or they hoard cash in literal safes at home. Japanese households are famous for keeping huge amounts of physical cash. When people stop saving, banks have less money to lend. When banks have less money to lend, businesses can't get capital, and the economy stagnates further. Zero interest rate policy also creates perverse incentives. It rewards debtors and punishes creditors. It encourages speculation instead of production. Why build a factory that might take 10 years to pay off when you can borrow free money and gamble it on real estate or stocks? Japan stayed at 0 interest rates for over 20 years. 20 years of free money, and the economy never recovered. The Nikkei stock index, which peaked at 38,915 in 1989, didn't return to that level until 2024. That's 35 years. An entire generation of Japanese investors saw 0 return on their stock investments. Imagine being a Japanese worker in 1989, putting money into your retirement account, and watching it go absolutely nowhere for 35 years. That's not a recession. That's a lost life. 3. The demographics of doom. When the workers disappear. Now let's talk about the variable that makes all of this exponentially worse. People. Specifically, the lack of young people. Japan has the oldest population on Earth. Nearly 30% of Japanese citizens are over the age of 65. The birth rate is 1.3 children per woman, far below the replacement rate of 2.1. Japan's population peaked in 2008 at 128 million and has been shrinking ever since. By 2050, Japan's population is projected to fall to under 100 million. By 2100, some estimates suggest it could be as low as 50 million. This is an economic death spiral. Here's why. Every economy depends on workers. Workers produce goods, pay taxes, and consume products. When you have a lot of young workers and fewer retirees, the system works great. The young pay into Social Security and the old collect. But when the pyramid flips, when you have more retirees than workers, the math breaks. In 1950, Japan had about 10 workers for every retiree. Today, it's about 2 workers per retiree. By 2050, it will be closer to 1-to-1. Imagine you're a young Japanese worker today. You're not just supporting yourself. You're supporting your parents, your grandparents, and through the tax system, millions of other elderly people you've never met. The Social Security tax burden is crushing. And for what? mathematically, that by the time you retire, the system will be bankrupt. There won't be anyone to pay for your retirement. So you're paying into a Ponzi scheme that you know will collapse before you can benefit. This destroys morale. It destroys birth rates further because young people can't afford to have kids when they are being taxed to death. And it creates a society that is psychologically old. Japan has the highest suicide rate among the elderly in the developed world. It has a word, kodokushi, which means dying alone. Thousands of elderly Japanese people die in their apartments every year and aren't discovered for weeks or months because they have no family, no visitors, no connections. The government tried to fix the demographics with immigration, but Japan is one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries on earth. It has a cultural resistance to immigration that makes even the most conservative American look like a hippie. So they tried robots. Japan leads the world in robotics. They've built robots to care for the elderly, robots to work in factories, robots to serve food. But robots don't pay taxes. Robots don't consume. Robots don't have children. You can't automate your way out of a demographic collapse. The cruel irony is that the zero interest rate policy we talked about earlier made the demographics worse. When saving is pointless, young people delay life milestones. They delay buying a house because real estate is still expensive relative to wages. They delay getting married because they can't afford a wedding. They delay having children because children are expensive and the future is terrifying. In trying to stimulate the economy with free money, Japan accidentally sterilized its population. 4. The zombie workforce. When ambition dies. Let's zoom in from the macro to the micro. Let's talk about what it actually feels like to live and work in a zombie economy. In Japan, there's a term, salaryman. It refers to the legions of white-collar workers who spend their entire careers at one company, climbing a rigid hierarchy, working brutal hours, and receiving modest, predictable paychecks. The salaryman was the backbone of Japan's economic miracle in the 1960s and 70s. Loyalty to the company was everything. But in the zombie economy, that loyalty became a prison. Because companies weren't growing, there were no promotions. You'd work at the same desk, doing the same job, for decades. Because wages were flat, there were no raises. Because the labor market was stagnant, there was no point in quitting because every other company was the same. You were stuck. And the psychological toll of being stuck is devastating. Japan has one of the highest rates of overwork death, karoshi, in the world. People literally work themselves to death, clocking 80, 100, sometimes 120-hour weeks. And for what? Not for a promotion. Not for a big bonus. Just to keep the job they already have. Because in a zero-growth economy, keeping your job is the victory. There's a phenomenon in Japan called hikikomori. These are people, usually young men, who completely withdraw from society. They lock themselves in their rooms for months or years, refusing to go outside, refusing to work, surviving on their parents' savings or government assistance. Estimates suggest there are over 1 million hikikomori in Japan. Why does this happen? Because when the economic ladder is broken, when there's no path forward, some people just stop trying. They opt out. They realize that the dream sold to them, work hard, get a good job, buy a house, raise a family, is mathematically impossible. So they stop participating. This is the ultimate symptom of a zombie economy. It's not just that the companies are dead, it's that the people lose hope. And here's the terrifying part. When an entire generation loses ambition, they don't pass ambition on to the next generation. Japanese schools are still academically rigorous, but there's a pervasive sense of, what's the point? The most talented young Japanese people, if they have the means, leave. They go to Silicon Valley, to Singapore, to London. They take their education, which Japanese taxpayers paid for, and they use it to enrich other countries. It's a brain drain in slow motion. 5. The debt that will never be repaid. A nation mortgaged to itself. Now let's talk about the number that should make your blood run cold. Japan's government debt is currently over 260% of GDP. That means the Japanese government owes more than 2.5 times the value of everything the entire country produces in a year. To put that in perspective, Greece, which nearly destroyed the European Union with its debt crisis in 2010, had debt of about 180% of GDP. Japan makes Greece look financially responsible. How did this happen? Remember all those stimulus packages we talked about? All those infrastructure projects? All those bank bailouts? All those social security payments to an aging population? They were paid for with debt. For over 30 years, the Japanese government has run a budget deficit almost every single year. They spend more than they collect in taxes, and they make up the difference by issuing bonds. But here's the weird thing. Japan hasn't collapsed. They haven't had a debt crisis like Greece or Argentina. Why not? Because of one unique factor. Japanese government bonds are almost entirely owned by Japanese citizens and institutions. About 90% of Japan's debt is held domestically. Japanese pension funds, insurance companies, and the Bank of Japan itself own the debt. This means that Japan owes money to itself. On the surface, this sounds safe. If you owe money to yourself, you can't really go bankrupt, right? But that's not quite true. Here's the problem. When the Bank of Japan buys government bonds, they pay for those bonds by creating new yen out of thin air. This is called monetizing the debt. They are literally printing money to pay the government's bills. In theory, this should cause massive inflation. You're increasing the money supply without increasing the amount of goods and services in the economy. That's the textbook definition of inflation. But Japan has barely had any inflation for 30 years. In fact, they've had periods of deflation where prices actually fell. How is that possible? Because the zombie economy we've been describing destroys demand. If workers aren't getting raises, if companies aren't investing, if consumers are terrified of the future, nobody is spending money aggressively. The newly printed money just sits in bank accounts or gets hoarded. It doesn't chase goods, so prices don't rise. But this creates a trap. The government is addicted to debt. They can't stop borrowing because if they tried to balance the budget by cutting spending or raising taxes, they'd crash the economy. But the more they borrow, the bigger the debt gets. And eventually, even if you owe money to yourself, the interest payments become unsustainable. Japan is rapidly approaching the point where interest payments on the debt will consume the majority of tax revenue. When that happens, the government will have no money left for schools, roads, defense, or anything else. Every yen collected will just go to servicing old debt. The only way out is inflation. If Japan can create 4% or 5% inflation per year, the real value of the debt shrinks. If you owe 10 trillion yen today and inflation runs at 5% for 10 years, that 10 trillion is worth a lot less in real terms. You've defaulted without officially defaulting. But here's the catch. After 30 years of training people to expect zero inflation, you can't just flip a switch and create inflation. The psychology is too ingrained. Even when the Bank of Japan tried to deliberately create inflation by printing even more money, it barely worked. Japan is trapped in a debt prison of its own making. They can't inflate their way out. They can't grow their way out. And they can't cut their way out. They're just stuck, slowly sinking, hoping that something, anything, changes before the water reaches their nose. 6. The American mirror. We are already repeating the mistakes. Now, let's turn the camera to the United States. If you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed something uncomfortable. Almost everything I've described about Japan is starting to happen here. Let's go down the checklist. Asset bubble? Check. The U.S. stock market is at all-time highs, despite an economy where real wages for most workers have been stagnant for 20 years. Housing prices in major cities are completely detached from incomes. The median home price in the U.S. is now over 6 times the median household income. In San Francisco and Los Angeles, it's over 10 times. That's not a market. That's a speculation frenzy. We've learned nothing from 2008. Zero interest rates? Check. The Federal Reserve held interest rates at zero or near zero from 2008 to 2022. 14 years of free money. They did raise rates in 2022 to fight inflation, but the moment the economy shows real pain, they'll cut again. We're addicted to cheap credit, just like Japan was. We can't function without it. Zombie companies? Check. A study by Bloomberg estimated that about 20% of the largest publicly traded companies in the United States are zombies. These are companies that don't earn enough profit to cover their interest payments on their debt. They only survive because interest rates have been so low that banks keep rolling over the loans. If interest rates stay elevated, these companies will start defaulting in waves. We're already seeing cracks. Look at the commercial real estate sector, which is collapsing as office buildings sit empty after COVID. Propping up failures? Check. In 2008, the U.S. bailed out the banks. In 2020, we bailed out everyone. We sent checks to individuals, forgivable loans to businesses, and unlimited liquidity to corporations. We didn't let bad companies fail. We didn't let bad debt get liquidated. We papered over the crisis with trillions of dollars in printed money. We did exactly what Japan did in 1990. We chose the path of least resistance, the path of delaying pain, and we will pay the same price. Aging demographics? Check. The U.S. birth rate is now 1.6 children per woman, below replacement rate. The baby boomers, the largest generation in American history, are retiring en masse. By 2030, all boomers will be over 65. Social Security and Medicare, which are already running deficits, are going to explode in cost. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that by 2050, these programs alone will consume the entire federal budget if nothing changes. We are heading toward the same worker-to-retiree ratio that broke Japan. Massive debt? Check. U.S. government debt is over $35 trillion, more than 120% of GDP. We're not at Japan's 260% yet, but we're on the same trajectory. We're running trillion-dollar deficits in peacetime during an expansion. What happens when the next recession hits? What happens when we have to bail out the system again? We'll print another few trillion and hope the dollar doesn't collapse. The pieces are all in place. We're doing the Japanese playbook, step by step, mistake by mistake. And American policymakers, the geniuses at the Federal Reserve and in Congress, are acting like this time will be different. They actually believe they can print prosperity. They think they're smarter than the Japanese. They're not. They're just 20 years behind. 7. The productivity death spiral. Why we've stopped innovating. Let's talk about the one number that determines long-term wealth. Productivity. Productivity is how much economic output you get per hour of work. If productivity is growing, it means workers are getting more efficient, companies are innovating, and living standards are rising. If productivity is flat, it means you're just running in place. And if productivity is falling, you're getting poorer. Japan's productivity growth died after 1990. For 30 years, the average Japanese worker produced roughly the same amount per hour as they did in the early 90s. There was no innovation, no efficiency gains, no breakthroughs. Why? Because the zombie companies sucked all the air out of the room. The capital, the talent, and the energy that should have gone into new technologies went into keeping the old guard alive. The United States is following the same path. American productivity growth has slowed dramatically since 2008. We had a brief bump during COVID as companies were forced to digitize, but it's fading. We're seeing the same pattern as Japan. The big incumbent corporations are using cheap debt to buy back their own stock and pay dividends to shareholders instead of investing in research and development. The disruptive startups that should be challenging them are getting acquired and killed before they can scale. The venture capital system, which used to fund real innovation, is now funding apps that deliver food slightly faster. We're not building the future, we're financializing the present. And just like Japan, this is creating a workforce that feels stuck. Look at the data. Young Americans are job hopping more than ever because there's no loyalty or career growth within companies. Wages for the bottom 50% have been flat for decades when adjusted for real inflation. Home ownership rates for people under 35 are at historic lows. The American dream, the idea that if you work hard, you'll do better than your parents, is dying. And here's the political danger. When an entire generation feels economically hopeless, they embrace radical solutions. In Japan, this hopelessness manifested as withdrawal and apathy. The hikikomori locked themselves in their rooms. In America, it's manifesting as political rage. The rise of populism on both the left and the right is a direct result of this economic stagnation. People are angry because the system isn't working for them, and they're right to be angry. But you know what else? 8. The coming deflation. When prices fall, but you still get poorer, one of the most counterintuitive aspects of the Japanese disease is deflation. Most people think deflation, falling prices, is good. After all, if things get cheaper, you can buy more, right? Wrong. Deflation in a debt-heavy economy is an economic nightmare. Here's why. When prices are falling, consumers delay purchases. Why buy a car today if it'll be cheaper in 6 months? Why buy a house today if real estate prices are dropping? This delay in spending causes businesses to cut production and lay off workers. Unemployment rises, wages fall, and the cycle feeds on itself. Falling prices lead to falling wages, lead to falling demand, lead to more falling prices. It's a deflationary spiral. But the real killer is what deflation does to debt. If you owe $100,000 and deflation is running at 2% per year, the real value of your debt is increasing. You borrowed money when a dollar bought less, and now you're paying it back when a dollar buys more. Your debt is growing in real terms even as you make payments. This is why the Great Depression was so devastating. It wasn't just that people lost their jobs. It was that their mortgages and farm loans became impossible to repay as prices collapsed. Japan has been fighting deflation on and off for 30 years, and despite printing trillions of yen, they've barely been able to get prices to rise. Why? Because when an economy is full of zombies and people are terrified of the future, no amount of money printing translates into actual spending. The money just sits there, dead capital and dead banks lending to dead companies. The United States is now at risk of the same trap. We had a bout of inflation in 2021-2023 due to supply chain chaos and stimulus checks. But as those effects fade, the underlying trend is disinflationary. We have an aging population that spends less. We have a zombie corporate sector that doesn't invest. We have a debt burden that makes everyone cautious. If the US enters a real recession, we could see deflation. And if we see deflation with $35 trillion in government debt and trillions more in corporate and household debt, we're going to learn exactly what Japan learned. You can't print your way out of a balance sheet recession. The only way out is default, either explicit or through inflation. And we just established that creating inflation in a zombified economy is nearly impossible. We're damned if we do, damned if we don't. 9. The social fracture, when society gives up. Economics isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about human lives. And what happens to a society when the economy stops working for an entire generation? It fractures. Japan has been a preview of this social decay. Despite being one of the safest countries on earth with low crime rates, Japan has one of the highest suicide rates in the developed world. Japanese men in their 40s and 50s, the prime working years, have a suicide rate that is staggering. Why? Because in a culture that defines your worth by your work, losing your job or being stuck in a dead-end career is a form of social death. The shame is unbearable. Japan also has a term, herbivore men, which refers to young men who have completely lost interest in romantic relationships, career advancement, or material success. They live minimalist lifestyles, work part-time jobs, and opt out of the traditional life script. They're not angry. They're not protesting. They've just given up. The United States is beginning to see similar patterns. The rise of deaths of despair, a term coined by economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton, refers to the spike in deaths from suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol-related diseases among working-class white Americans. These are people who feel left behind by the economy, who see no future, and who self-medicate into oblivion. The opioid crisis is not just a healthcare issue. It's an economic issue. It's what happens when entire regions lose their industries and have nothing to replace them. And we're also seeing declining marriage rates, plummeting birth rates, and a generation of young men who spend more time on video games and pornography than in the real world. These are not moral failings. These are rational responses to an economy that has locked them out. When you can't afford a house, can't get a stable job, and can't see a path to starting a family, why bother? You retreat into virtual worlds where at least you can feel successful. This social fracture has political consequences. In Japan, it led to decades of political apathy. Voter turnout is low. The same party has ruled for most of the last 70 years. People don't believe politics can fix anything, so they stop participating. In America, it's leading to the opposite. People are politically engaged, but in a destructive, tribal way. They're not voting for solutions. They're voting for revenge against the elites they believe screwed them. 10. The endgame. What happens? When the zombies finally fall, so what's the endgame here? If America is following Japan's path, where does it lead? There are 3 possible scenarios, and none of them are pleasant. Scenario 1, the long stagnation. This is the Japanese outcome. America muddles along for 20 or 30 years with low growth, low inflation, low interest rates, and low expectations. The zombies never die. The debt keeps growing. Living standards slowly erode. The dollar remains the global reserve currency out of inertia, not strength. We become a slowly declining empire that still has a massive military and cultural influence, but can't take care of its own people. This is the most likely scenario because it's the path of least resistance. Politicians will keep kicking the can down the road because the alternatives are too painful to contemplate. Scenario 2, the inflationary explosion. Eventually, the debt becomes so massive that the government has no choice but to inflate it away. The Federal Reserve goes full Weimar and prints tens of trillions of dollars. Inflation spikes to 10%, 15%, maybe even 20% per year. Savers are wiped out. Anyone on a fixed income is destroyed, but the debt gets devalued. The government survives. This scenario is politically easier than cutting spending, which is why it happens throughout history. The question is whether the dollar can survive as the reserve currency if we go down this path. If the world loses faith in the dollar, hyperinflation becomes a real possibility. Scenario 3, the hard default. This is the nightmare scenario. A major shock, maybe a war, maybe a financial crisis, forces the US government to explicitly default on its debt. Social Security gets cut by 50%, Medicare gets rationed, and government workers get furloughed. It would be a social and political catastrophe, possibly leading to civil unrest or even secession movements. This scenario is the least likely because the US has the printing press. But if we're in a deflationary trap where printing doesn't create inflation and the debt spiral becomes mathematically impossible to sustain, default becomes the only option. Which scenario do we get? Probably a mix of 1 and 2. We'll stagnate for a decade, then inflate aggressively, then stagnate again. We'll lurch from crisis to crisis, each time eroding a little more wealth from the middle class, each time concentrating a little more power in the hands of the people closest to the money printer. And through it all, the average American will work harder, earn less in real terms, and wonder why the dream their grandparents had feels so impossibly far away. 11. What you can do. Building your lifeboat. Let's end on something practical. You can't fix the system. You're not a central banker or a senator, but you can protect yourself. Here's the playbook for surviving the zombification of America. First, avoid zombie assets. Do not buy long-term bonds. In a world of money printing and potential inflation, bonds are return-free risk. Do not hold large amounts of cash for long periods. Cash will slowly lose purchasing power. Second, own hard assets. Real estate in desirable locations will hold value. Farmland, energy infrastructure, commodities. These are things that produce real value and can't be printed. Stocks and companies with pricing power, companies that can raise prices without losing customers, will outperform. Third, own gold and Bitcoin. Gold is the 5,000-year-old hedge against currency debasement. Bitcoin is the digital version. You don't need to go all in, but a 5 to 10% allocation is rational insurance. Fourth, invest in yourself. Skills, education, health, relationships. In a low-growth world, your ability to create value is your most important asset. Learn skills that are hard to automate. Build a network of people you trust. Fifth, expect less from the system. The government will not save you. Social Security will be cut or inflated away. Your 401k might not be enough. Plan accordingly. Build multiple income streams. Have a plan B. The zombies are coming. They're already here. The question is whether you're going to be one of them or whether you're going to build a life raft and survive the flood. Japan lost 30 years. America is about to lose the next 30. The pattern is clear. The math is undeniable. The only question is whether you're going to let it take you down with it. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand how this all connects to the global currency wars, check out our video on the death of the petrodollar. And let me know in the comments, do you think America can avoid Japan's fate, or are we already too far gone? I read every comment. See you in the next one.